Thanks for tuning in to the Drive On podcast, where we're focused on giving hope and strength to the entire military community. Whether you're a veteran, active duty, guard, reserve, or a family member, this podcast will share inspirational stories and resources that are useful to you. I'm your host, Scott DeLucio, and now let's get on with the show. Welcome back to the Drive On podcast. Today, my guest is Mike Kim. Mike is a psychoanalyst and an ex-monk and retired U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Vet Center site director and lead war trauma readjustment counselor. His research at Columbia University is focused on his original theory of veteran readjustment culture. And besides being a war veteran, Mike's work has advocated for vets, military personnel, and families since the early 1990s. He has over 20,000 clinical hours in facilitating war trauma therapy. His military experience started back in 1986, and he has intermittently served until 2009. He's a graduate of Norwich Military College of Vermont, where my brother actually also attended, Yale University, and I'm also from Connecticut, so familiar with it, and the Harvard program in Refugee Trauma. In this episode, we're going to be chatting about the mental health options for veterans and how transitioning out of the military impacts all of our lives after we take the uniform off. So without further ado, Mike, welcome to the show. Really glad to have you here.
So it's an honor. I mean, I appreciate learning about you through Ryan and Vet with a Mic, and also just your presence within the veteran community. Your name has passed on, but I was just like, all right, how do I locate this guy? And now it all happened where we were able to meet each other, even though hearing from you indirectly from people. And it's great. It's great to be here to talk about veteran issues in the military. I just devoted my whole life to the veteran cause. I think much like your brother, and God bless him, at Norwich, having a expansive education was very important as far as not just being someone in the military, but having this expansive mind to learn about different issues and have like a interdisciplinary type of education. So that's why I ended up studying theology, spirituality, psychoanalysis, history. And right now I'm at Columbia University in two departments, and my advisors from the psych department, and then my second advisors from the arts and humanities department. And I'm focusing a lot on this theory tied to veteran readjustment. And it's actually, as I name it, veteran readjustment culture. And yeah, I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's crazy how the veteran community, it seems like it's such a small world, because there are people like you're saying how my name came up and how do I get in touch with this guy? But through various connections, you ended up getting introduced to me, and I'm glad that we did. As we get out there and we're talking to other people and we're getting different episodes recorded for this podcast and other podcasts, like Ryan's podcast that you mentioned, Bet with a Mic. I've been on his show. He's been on mine. We just form those connections, and then it just makes it so much easier for us all to spread that network out and help each other out. And I really love how all of that came together. It wasn't something that I initially anticipated would happen with this podcast, where I would have such a huge network of people that we now can tap into. But it's really great the way it's happened. And over the past little over 3 years now that I've been doing this podcast, I have found so many people that we're able to help each other out just through these connections that we make. And it's really great how all that works out. So let's get into this a little bit here. So for the listeners, and probably myself included, I know I've heard of psychologists and psychiatrists, and in the introduction, I mentioned that you're a psychoanalyst. Could you explain what it is that you do that's different, or perhaps even the same, for myself and the listeners that might not be as familiar with psychoanalysts as I might be with some of the other psychology areas?
Right. And I appreciate your examined question. So the reason why I became a psychoanalyst was I was at Yale working on a graduate degree, and my advisor there was just like going through the different psychoanalytic areas. I mean, psychological and counseling areas. And what intrigued me was psychoanalysis because, like you, and then thinking about like the military, I'm, I want I want to go through like an extremely rigorous program. I say that because you're a grunt, and I don't know if I could fully call myself a grunt. I'll get into that in the future, but like, yeah, like I know I'm a hard charger, and the thing about it is psychoanalysis. You have to have an advanced degree first before going into psychoanalytic training. So you've got to already have like an MD or a PhD or a legitimate, robust master's degree with advanced clinical training or a social work degree, but a full on social work degree, like licensed. I wanted to go into a deeper understanding of psychotherapy, and psychoanalysis is the birthplace for therapy, talk therapy, and counseling. Not only that, a lot of people don't realize this, but it is also the home of war trauma treatment because it's Freud who begins treating veterans from World War I in his free clinic. So that's very important to mention. It's a free clinic where veterans can come in and out to receive care. Freud had three sons in the military, highly decorated. One was a POW, and he had an investment not just towards healing veterans, but to promote an understanding of what veterans were going through. And he started the first major like conference for veterans. I mean, veteran treatment personnel, clinicians, folks like Ferenczi, I believe Young attended, just like the top names of clinicians back then were involved because of Freud. And to me, it's important to always look at the roots before going into your practice. And so I went into understanding trauma at a very early time of my clinical development. And I think it has rewarded me on so many levels because I didn't have like a shake and bake clinical degree. Not saying that folks who do are bad therapists. So I would not say that. I would say that I wanted to really understand way to provide care for veterans. And I think one major principle that isn't offered in a lot of the therapies is to understand resistance, but to do it in a very human kind of way. And you and I, whether it's a podcast or meeting vets at social events, you always find vets who are resistant towards either talking about things, either going for help, or dealing with their families. And psychoanalysis just helps you as a clinician look at the other person's resistances and to find a way to engage that resistance in a very trust filled environment that is aimed at not just looking at someone's problems. I mean, what I love about psychoanalysis versus like the other types of counseling is, and I know with our good friend Ryan, we were talking about this, about counseling and psychotherapy. Counseling has like a specific kind of goal. If you're an addictions counselor, you're going to focus on addictions. You're not going to talk about your childhood or anything that much. It's your treatment goals are like addiction. In psychoanalysis, you would kind of like devise a treatment plan that would involve the many different faces of that veteran's life. So you would be looking at not just the problems, but you would be looking at a lot of root causes to those problems as well.
And that makes sense to me. And I am in no way trained in any of this. So this could be just, this is just one man's opinion. And it take it or leave it for whatever it's worth for the listeners. But to me, it seems like if you can focus on the overall picture of what's going on with someone, right? Like if the person is going into marriage counseling and they're having trouble at home, but it turns out the reason why they're having trouble at home is because they're stressed at work and they have all these problems going on at work, and they're having problems with their boss or not meeting their deadlines for whatever reason, they're bringing that home, and now that's causing tension at home, in their marriage and their family life and everything like that. Well, it makes sense to look at the overall picture, because yeah, you can try to focus on just the marriage, just at home. You can just look at that one slice of the pie, but if you're ignoring the other piece, the work side of things, then maybe you're not going to get to the root cause of the issue, and that's just going to continue to fester like a cancer almost, and it's going to continue to spread through into other areas of the person's life. And that's really what I think you need to do, is drill down to the root cause of whatever the issues are. And if you're talking about substance abuse, if the person's abusing certain substances because of some trauma that happened early on in their life and in their childhood or whatever, well, maybe let's address that, because maybe that will help resolve the substance abuse problem to begin with, right? So all of this makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm really interested. Again, I am in no way, shape, or form a counselor or a therapist or anything like that. This is interesting to me to see this more holistic kind of approach to the types of issues that we're talking about today. So thank you for that, and that little bit of a introduction into what it is that you do and how that differs maybe in terms of some of the other practices that are out there.
And those other practices, they serve a purpose, right?
Sure.
So with psychoanalysis, one, I wouldn't say a flaw, but I would say maybe not a strength, would be like immediate kind of like management of like a symptom. So maybe something like exposure therapy or EMDR could be more help in that. And so I like, I always liked having an eclectic approach to therapy. And I've used, and I ended up training in EMDR, in IPT, interpersonal therapy. I had some indirect training for cognitive processing therapy, and also rational emotive therapy. So I'm familiar with the different fields of mental health and wellness. I just chose psychoanalysis because the way I work with people, I like to work with them long term, and to look at what you're saying about the whole life of the vet, as we've talked about earlier. And this is one of the essential parts of my veteran readjustment culture theory, approach, concept, whatever you want to call it. It's about looking at who the vet is before he joined the military. What was that quality of life? The good, the bad, the ugly. Who was the person who would end up being Jody later on, Jody
Yeah.
boy, and the guy who takes your girlfriend while you're like deployed or in training, and then who you are during the military, whether you're deployed or not. What are the positive parts? What are the parts that triggered you while you were in the military? And then post-military life. And that's why I think I really was able to connect with your different podcasts, and an interview I heard that was done by a university, an Australian university that you were in, that kind of presented those micro narratives that ended up being like a larger narrative that you provided the audience.
Right. Right. Yeah. And all of that stuff pieced together, it helps to make sense of what's going on in the here and now when you take all of those pieces into consideration, as opposed to just the one subset of, okay, what's the major symptom that we're trying to help, right? To me, that it does make sense. So in the intro, I mentioned that you have over 20,000 clinical hours in war trauma therapy. And so there's an author, Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote about the 10,000-hour rule. And whether you agree with that rule or not, in his book called Outliers, he claims that
Agree.
the key to achieving world-class expertise in any skill is, to a large extent, a matter of practicing the correct way for a total of around 10,000 hours. And um, again, whether or not that 10,000 hour rule is true, I feel like we're probably listening to an expert on the topic of clinical, or sorry, in war trauma therapy, just due to the nature of how much time you have invested in this type of thing. So, what are some of the trends that you've seen throughout your career with the soldiers coming back from war and the traumas that they've encountered, and how they cope with them?
I'm glad you asked that because in a lot of my research and reflections, I've come up with the main thing that the military does not recognize, and even I think the VA is starting to recognize, and that is, call it moral injury, but it's more than that. I would say because it doesn't have to be an injury. I mean, there are injuries, but there are also like moral triumphs too in the military. The thing is that our relationships are not studied. So when someone, not you, but well, I could be candid because you mentioned that you in your other interview that you've pursued therapy. I have too, and
Sure.
everything. So when we've gone through therapy, like at the VA, I know a lot of people that are great, and I know some people who are not so great. But I know that when I experience a novice therapist, they're just focused on the events, that occurred in war. They're just like looking for that silver bullet, because from there they could easily try to diagnose you for PTSD. This is not a conspiracy. It's just that our mass culture, and this is why I got into readjustment culture, interpreting it in my way. The media, PTSD, the government, PTSD, everywhere around, you've got this whole thing about PTSD. And that seemed to be the signifier attached to the veteran. But the veteran is so much more than that. And so what I notice is the relationships, the interpersonal relationships that you have from day one with your recruiter. Like, damn it, I got this promise. I got Hawaii and I got sent to Greenland. That's an interpersonal issue that I've actually heard people, older folks, just older vets talk about, as far as like, I didn't want to be this. I didn't want to be in admin, or I didn't want to be a grunt, but I just signed a contract. So these interpersonal relationships, and then when you're looking at deployment, you could have a real positive first sergeant, or you can have someone who just doesn't care about you as a first sergeant, right? Or as far as his company, he could just be focused on whatever administrative stuff, or his own deployment. But the bottom line is, you've got different people. The person you went to boot camp with, and or basic training with, and slept above you, that's a relationship. Your team members, these are relationships. The relationships you have as you're exiting the military, those matter too. Your relationship with leadership, different leaders, might be very different, like once you get into garrison and you're ready to leave the military. And then those relationships, which aren't examined really in the VA, or in like with fellow veterans, those become unexamined. So I think that's a big issue that's not really covered. And I think that's like key to get into a lot of the events tied to trauma and the manifestations of trauma, because relationships, you hold on to them deeply, just like your family, whether they were good or bad, they stick with you. And especially in the military, whether you like it or not, it's an artificial family, right?
Right.
It's an artificial family with depth for many. And then for certain folks, they just reject that artificial reality. When I say artificial, I don't mean fake. I mean, you're put into something that's called a brotherhood or sisterhood, and you're supposed to treat each other with family. But at the same time, you have the UCMJ, which is ultimately daddy. And that's one major thing that I just can't understand why there hasn't been like a lot of research on. And I think it could help not just clinicians, but as we deal with veterans. So the first question, usually when you're like at a bar and you meet a vet is like, what did you do? Or where were you? It's the conversations never go around like, dude, did you get along with your squad, your team leader? Because I thought he was a douchebag. Mine was like a douchebag. Like, what did you think? Like, that's those, believe it or not, those little micro stories are telling of many things within your veteran narrative. And so I would say that's a major issue. I would say another major issue is family of origin, because I also did, I'm probably one of the few, and it's not bragging, but it is because I like to brag. The thing is, as a clinician, that's it. But like our family issues really come out on so many levels. And when I was doing interviews, like more than 5,000 hours or close to 10,000 hours of not therapy, of just sitting down and doing these interviews. And that's what Freud started looking at. What's your life like? And so I went through those different stages with them before, during, and after. And what I found so interesting is that their lives, in many ways, were so different than what's presented in the media. For example, I worked with a lot of Vietnam veterans, and when you hear about the 50s and about the great kind of like days of prosperity and all that, and World War II guys came back and they helped build America, and that's all true. At the same time, I would say, from what I learned in these many hours of like with Vietnam veterans who grew up during this time, during what I call the happy days time, the show with the Fonz, that there were high levels of alcoholism from a lot of their World War II veteran fathers to cope with World War II. There was a lot of domestic violence. There were a lot of examples of child abuse, neglect, unemployment on different levels. So it wasn't like the 50s had everyone in the middle class. It was just very important to like get that type of data, because I got to see something very different than what's presented in the media. And then how that's also useful as far as looking at the veteran reality is that the myths that we have and that we carry on to war or even after the war, it can be shattered. But having a knowledge of that can be very restorative. A good example of that is, I don't know if you read the book or saw the movie or have done both, Born on the 4th of July. Ronnie Kovac kind of gives that narrative that I'm talking about, that you gave and that I've given. Who is the person before, during, and after? And he really showed like his idyllic life on Long Island as far as like his views on war and the Cold War patriotism, which it's not bad or good. It's just a historical reality that occurred. And he lived through that, and he brought that with him to war, and he did 2 enlistments. And even after experiencing being paralyzed from the waist down, he was still caught up with a lot of those myths. And then those myths were somewhat shattered. Well, my thing is, who's going to be there to help you deal with that shattering when you're cracked open that way? And so I think understanding people's lives, the myths that they lived through before they entered the military, while they were in the military, and after, have to be like examined. So I would say understanding these tropes and myths so that even you and I, like, I don't know, I'm a big fan of movies, but I'm into those like, Frenchie, put on my beret and smoke my cigarette like that, and those type of movies. And so all my friends make fun of me and stuff like that. And then so some of them were shocked when I said, man, I want to see Top Gun Maverick because, that like, I don't know, it influenced me when I was, but even though I had horrible eyesight, I was like, man, I want to be like Maverick. And I think it was very inspirational for me, like right before I joined the military. And when you understand myths and tropes, you can see a lot of how it's definitely pro Navy recruiting kind of movie and all that. But at the same time, you don't use myths, I believe, to like trash people, but to understand people and a work of art or a literary piece. And by putting my psychoanalytic lens and studying these myths, I could watch Top Gun, I could watch Maverick and also understand, and I don't want to give away the movie for the audience if they haven't seen it, but there's a lingering moral injury there from the first movie. So imagine this mass media movie, with how many blockbuster sales, and at the same time, you've got this hidden kind of like message there that if you're a vet, you can pick that up. And so I would say the recognition of myths and the misrecognition of myths have come up in a lot of veterans, and we've worked with them, as well as the myths on the enemy, right? So a lot of my work was involved with Vietnam veterans who I cherish, but I was just like, why do you have to keep on using gook? I know you like me. I know I'm not going to call you racist. I'm not here to judge you. Okay. This is a safe environment, but I just want to know. And and we're in a group therapy process, I just, maybe they're interested in knowing. And we'd have like open discussions about it over and over again. And what I found was I was able to understand their meaning of it, of these words, and they were able to understand the myths tied to those words and why those myths were used to dehumanize the enemy, because they were taught, just like we were taught, to be focused on, if need be, kill the enemy. You can't look at the enemy as a human being in combat. I mean, according to the indirect messaging that's given out in the military. I'm not saying that's protocol or what the generals are planning. It's just a coping survival technique. So I would say those are two things. And then I would say another big issue when it comes to a lot of what's going on in the veteran terrain, in providing therapy, is the understanding and misunderstanding of the veteran civilian divide. So I would have vets come in and they're just like, almost knocked out the civilian, this hippie. And I was like, did you know my first sergeant like named me hippie? And then he's like, well, you're a hippie, really? And then I was just like, I mean, whatever. I always had longer hair, and I was always being threatened to be court-martialed, even as an officer. That's just who I am. And they were like, really? And so what is a hippie? And talking about this whole thing of civilians not being another enemy, because we've got enough challenges with our own enemy, ultimately ourselves, right? For being exposed in this unnatural environment called war. When I say unnatural, I mean, it's not like you walk down Wall Street and there's a rocket attack happening.
Right.
Yeah. So war is a very unnatural kind of environment for people, and readjustment is a natural thing to happen. Symptoms are natural. And I think one of the symptoms that's not really explored as much is this issue of the veteran civilian divide. Now, on the veteran side, where I don't give a pass with some of these veteran writers who have written a lot on it and have mentioned it in different books and different commentaries and different editorials, I would go against their position where they think, well, civilians just don't know what's going on, and they didn't, only 1% kind of join in the military. That's true. That's the beginning. But what we need to also understand is, how did that come about? Like the policies of all volunteer army in 1973, right? In many ways, to not have the whole general public involved in the military cause. So is it the civilian who is responsible, or maybe a higher level? And again, it's not a conspiracy. It's just trying to understand systems, like who set this policy for all volunteer army, and how is that set up, and what's involved in a draft. I'm part of the New York draft board in Manhattan. So like, if there is a national emergency, I'm going to have to evaluate records of different people who have to be drafted, whether we don't have an active draft, but we have selective service. And that's basically a draft. And most folks don't understand that. Veterans don't understand that. Many veterans don't understand it. A lot of civilians don't understand it. And so I think it's easy to just blame a civilian for this veteran civilian gap or divide. And I would also say that another contributor to the myth is, I don't think a lot of veterans, I mean, I appreciate your work and the work of other veterans. So I shouldn't generalize, but there are certain veterans that only see themselves as veterans when they come back. And there's reasons for that. There's reasons for that, legitimate reasons for that. And they could possibly have their own resistance towards the civilian world. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are deeper problems, like veteran unemployment, that has never truly been studied, as well as policies implemented to alleviate veteran unemployment. And so that's more of an issue of a divide, policy divides to help veterans readjust. Universal mental health service for all who have served. That is a policy issue that should be brought up. That's the divide with veterans in society. Not because there's not enough people to join, or because these people are insensitive, these civilians. I mean, I see this in a lot of different books and all of that.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that how many veterans have a tough time readjusting back into civilian life after leaving the military, myself included. I was National Guard, so it wasn't as much of a transition, but still that label change from a service member to a veteran, it plays some tricks on you. And yeah, it was something I anticipating as I was getting out of the National Guard. But the thing to me, it makes it hard for me to wrap my head around this whole issue with this transition, is that we all were civilians at one point before joining the military. So we obviously know what civilian life is like, where we don't necessarily have your first sergeant, your platoon sergeant on your case, telling you where to be, what to wear, when you can eat, when you can do this and that and everything. Um, but then on the other hand, for a lot of us, we were 18 or 19-year-olds when we joined the military and didn't have a care in the world. We still probably lived in mom and dad's house. So we did have that quote unquote first sergeant with your parents there who were telling you, okay, you gotta, it's time to eat. It's time to make your bed. It's time to go do all this stuff. And maybe not to that extent, but they were still, you're living under their roof. They're telling you what to do. And then after leaving the military, whether we're only in for a few years or stayed in for 20, whatever it is, uh, we get out with it, real world responsibilities. We're adults now. We're not the carefree kids that we used to be. Maybe we started a family while we're in the military, or have other responsibilities and things like that. Most of us in regular civilian life, we go through a gradual shift. We graduate high school, we either go to college or start a job, and then we slowly work our way into things. And it's like just slowly walking into the water and getting used to that cold water as you're walking in, and is much easier to do than just jumping in the deep end. And it seems like that's what a lot of people are doing as they're getting out of the military is they're jumping into the deep end of civilian life, expecting that they need to be at that same place as the rest of their peers who have had the opportunity to gradually dip their toes in, if you will. So it's interesting to me to uh, see all of the different issues that people have. Like you said, I wanted to knock that hippie out or whatever. Like there's a lot of different issues, but what can we do to help make it easier for the veterans who are in this adjustment phase, this readjustment back into civilian life? What can we do to help them along?
Well, I think what's interesting is what Jonathan Shea, Dr. Shea was a pioneer, is a pioneer in understanding war trauma, PTSD. What was interesting, and he had, I don't know, 20 to 30 years at the Boston VA, and he primarily worked with Vietnam veterans. He wrote a very interesting book called Achilles in Vietnam. And in like at the end of the book, the question is posed, what can be done after he spends extensive time talking about war trauma, and he talks about the different case studies and all of this. What's really interesting is he pointed out something that I think many in the clinical world miss, and that's the communalizing, and this isn't communism, the communalizing veteran readjustment. And so that's why I'm always intrigued in understanding veteran readjustment culture. Like how do vets congregate? How, like this is a way of congregating. I mean, we're connected to other people, the audience. I'm connected to you. You're connected to me. Those are interpersonal ways of healing that kind of, in many ways, I wouldn't say repair, but they reacclimate, because I don't think the word repair, I think it assumes that we're broken. I want to use a word, and any of you clinicians don't copy me. I use the word reacclimate because we were used to certain bonds in the military, good bonds and bad bonds. But those good bonds, to a certain extent, I feel, were maybe redemptive in this extreme thing called war, and help people get through war through these bonds, those that were good bonds, positive bonds.
Mhm.
So I think that needs to be, we need to create domains for that. So whether it's the podcast world, whether it's outings, I mean, for all that you criticize, and my sister and I, we fight, she's combat vet too, and all that. She looks like me, but I'm prettier, and I'm in the South, we say prettier, like Ric Flair. Like I'm prettier than she is, and whatever. She's 7 years younger, and she deployed to Afghanistan, and she was career. Um, but what I find, like in her narrative, is that she uses Wounded Warrior Project because she's a mother of three, and they go to Six Flags, and they have other parents. And I'm just like a dude. I have my son. I didn't get married. My son knows like what the deal is. And we're just like, whatever, like cool. But my sister's reality is the uncool mom jeans and living in the burbs, not in Manhattan like me. And her readjustment is very different. So she needs Wounded Warrior Project to a certain extent, because for whatever sins they had in the past, they've always offered activities to get people together, to get veterans and families together. And that's a way of communalizing, and they're authentic, and they're not like hustling money out of vets, and they're just gifts so that a veteran and his family or her family can like experience a time together and also meet other vets along the way. So I would say creating domains is one thing. I do feel that having a more holistic approach to readjustment should be looked at, as far as that approach for psychoanalysis to be incorporated more on different levels to look at the whole life of the vet. And there's been some moves. They did a very successful research study at Bethesda, and with using a psychoanalytic practice for some patients who couldn't adapt to other to other treatments. But I'm not saying it to promote psychoanalysis. What I'm saying is that our outlooks towards veterans need to be more holistic versus, man, you were like a sniper. Like one of my closest friends was one of the top snipers, Marco. And during COVID, whatever, we lost touch in a way for a short period of time. I was going through some issues with my son, and it was COVID. The VA had no plan, as you remember, and he took his life. And like your mission in helping veterans and civilians become more aware of veteran suicide, I'm fully supportive in what you do. And I believe that society, this is where society can be more active. And I would even say the military and the VA can be more proactive as far as identifying someone who's Marco. And I don't minimize the company clerk, but Marco's stuck in an apartment in Colorado for all those days during COVID, a sniper and a team leader who saw a very intimate side of war that a lot of people don't see. Now, should the VA flag that to a certain extent, not negatively flag it, but like to maybe offer more supportive care to this person, even during COVID? I think that something like that is like needed. And so the context of the veteran has to be like understood when you're helping veterans, treating veterans, hosting veterans to different functions, is trying to understand the context. You're not always going to get that. And we also have veterans have like, we can get lost, which is good too, in that collective reality of fellowship. But to make an effort to understand context is important, especially if you're a clinician,
Yeah, that's true. The context, and I think we're sort of talking about before, where you're looking at the overall picture of the person, not just, okay, this person served in the army for X number of years. What do they do in the army? Again, not to minimize the clerks or the cooks or people like that, but what did they do? Were they a sniper? Okay, well, yeah, maybe we want to follow up with this person a little bit more closely, because that is a very intimate job that you have. That is literally what was the AT&T, the reach out and touch someone. Like, that is a one-on-one connection. You're seeing that whole process unfold through the lens of your scope, and it is very personal, and that can have a significant toll on somebody. And so looking into people like that, people who have, even if you want to make it easy and categorize people with Purple Hearts or things like that, where you can say, okay, these people probably are going to need some additional follow-up. They may be resistant to reaching out and asking for this kind of help, but let's put it out there. Let's make it as easy as possible for these people to get the help and the services that they might need. And again, like we were saying before, let's plant those seeds, and hopefully those seeds take root. And they may not with everybody. You can lead the horse to water. You can't make them drink, but at least you're making that effort, and you're showing that, hey, we care about what's going to happen to you, and we want the best for you. So let's work together to make this as good of a process as we can. Right. Yeah. So before we wrap up here, I know you have a podcast and some other stuff that you might want to talk about a little bit. Tell us where people can go. First off, tell us about the podcast and where people can go to find it, and everything like that. Anything else that you might have to talk about as well.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's great because I started podcasting in 2016 with Warfighter Radio Network, and the terrain has just changed. The equipment and everything has changed. And you've given me a lot of like great advice as far as the podcast that I'm going to be a part of. The great people at Coming Home Well. So cominghomewell.com, you'll be able to look at the different shows that I'll have. One show, the shows will alternate as far as I'll have people on the video show on one episode, and then the next episode it'll go into kind of like an individual type of reflection type of a show where I review books and I talk about different technical issues regarding therapy and things within the veteran terrain and other expressions regarding veteran culture. And then it'll go back to guest, and then it'll go back to like reflections. And so you'll have access to me that way. You'll also be able to see the different interviews I've done. And this is definitely one of the best. And I'm not jock riding. You'll be able to just Google Mike Kim veteran, and you'll be able to find my different articles as well as academic presentations. I focus a lot on veteran readjustment culture, and I just delivered a lecture academic presentation at the University of North Texas Health Science Center. And for the academic year of 21 to 22, it got the most views. And so my podcast focuses on veteran readjustment culture. I'll be having different folks from the veteran terrain, cats like you and others, and Rudy Reyes, and we're going to be talking about how they're making contributions towards veteran culture. You could also reach me at on Instagram, Mike Kim Veteran, and I welcome any type of questions and invitations. This has just been a great experience because I felt as though you are attuned to some of the things that I've been researching, and I won't give you credit. No, I will give you credit. And I really appreciate being on here.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you taking the time to come on and join me. It really has been a pleasure speaking with you and hearing a little bit more about what it is that you do in your space and some of the research that you've done. So thank you again for coming on and taking the time to join me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Drive On Podcast. If you want to check out more episodes or learn more about the show, you can visit our website, driveonpodcast.com. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Drive On Podcast.